Hey there guys, and welcome back. So, evidently a mistake was made here. This was, at this point, this being 2/12 that I'm recording this on, 2 months ago, evidently I did session 35. And this was right before I went on break for the holidays. And evidently I never recorded that episode and I never pushed it to GitHub. So, at this point, I do not know what exactly I did in session 35. So session 35 and session 36 are going to be joint ventures. We're going to cover both of them at the same time. And there is a lot of code here. As you can see right here, 1,667 lines added and 108 deletions. And frankly, it's one of those things back to, since none of that was captured, that's captured in aggregate. Therefore, I wrote definitely way more than 1,667 lines and ended up deleting a good part of it or rewriting part of it across time. So there is a lot to go over in this. I'm going to go ahead and just keep on the GitHub for a quick moment, and we'll go over the UI really quick just because that's very simple. I fixed the resizing on the status boxes. Those are those boxes on the left hand side that tell you what supplies you have, what weapons, and provide any messages. That was a little bit wonky because we were working with different size boxes and animations and whatnot. I went through and fixed that. That's the last thing I did. That's, was pretty straightforward. It was just, I'm just going to recreate new animation scenes and then attribute them appropriately. And then the next thing we'll cover is, you'll notice here, this used to be the plus meeples, minus meeples. Well, I decided that we're going to use arrows in other places for incrementing and decrementing things. So it made less sense to have this as specifically meeples. I renamed it to table incrementer and added TD plus in here and TD minus. So we made that change. It's a very simple and straightforward change. Just need to change what classes are on our tables and whatnot for the meeples tables, the job tables. And that updates those, and then we can go ahead and reuse those in other parts of the code. So that was extremely straightforward. And then down here, this is all of the travel prep stuff. So this is stylizing our loadouts. So there's the loadouts right there. Actually starting up there, my bad. So there's the loadouts right there. And then here's cargo over here. Cargo would be the stuff in the mech that you don't have equipped right now, so not in your loadout. That would be any extra weapons or items and all your resources. For testing purposes, I wanted more than one item, so I went ahead and added in a new item, which is basically a stun gun. It disables a weapon, or technically speaking, it sets it back to cooldown. It sets it back onto cooldown. It resets the timer on there. So that was very straightforward. That was this here, and then if we hop over to callbacks, that would be disable random down here. As you can see, just grabs a random opponent's weapon and sets it on cooldown. And then we got 2 more quick changes that I'll go over. The first of the quick changes is that I added the subtype fuel here to equipment change. This is whenever our reactor power changes. So that's very simple and straightforward. In equipment change, we had timers as our other subtype and weapons, I believe, as the other subtype after that. However, I made a change that modified that as well. So that's actually no longer like that. We'll go over that when we get over to VS Code. And then the last of the extremely minor changes is that on the attached panel callback, so this is again the status panels we were talking about, I did change it so that you can just click on the header instead of clicking on specifically the button on the status panel in order to open it and close it. And we'll go ahead and look at that really quick before we hop into VS Code. Alright, so we'll go ahead and look at what we got so far really quick. Just load up my save file. And first off, like I said, left hand side here, as you can see, if I click here, we can now close these just by clicking the header rather than having to click the button. The button still works, but it's one of these things I figured it was a little too tedious to click this little button right here. So that's why I changed that on click to the entire header. Go ahead and minimize that for a hot second. Well, actually not for a hot second, probably for forever, because we're going to now look at how the loadout system works. And I'll just grab basically everything. We'll grab, I already have resources, so let's hop over here. So first off, you can put something into your loadout. This is in order, and this is probably how we're going to display it on the combat screen. That's my guess. So it will look exactly like this on the combat screen, so you know exactly where everything's at. This can be moved around, just drag, and as you can see, if you miss, if you click off it, it puts it back into your inventory. So one of those things. That's the easiest way to put things back, is just to, if it's not in a valid area, automatically return it to the colony's inventory. Next up, as you can see, if I do this, a couple things are going to happen. Ready? First off, this shifted battle axe down. So this bucket now shifts left to right. So as I keep on adding things, it will just shift them along, or I can go ahead and add them into empty spaces. Adding it into an empty space won't shift anything else. So that's how that works. And if I put something right here, so let's grab this laser pistol, put it on the energy sword. As you see, it goes into the cargo hole. Again, that's the extra weapons that do not fit into the loadout or do not have in the loadout. So it automatically transfers there. The next thing that happened that you probably noticed is these resources popped up, because these are your required resources to use these weapons. So since the game knows that you're going to need ammunition in order to use this equipment, it automatically loads them up into your resources, so you can see that. Also, just a minor thing really quick while I'm thinking about it, this corresponds. I use the same color scheme here as up here. So if we take a repair bot and put it into our items here, you can see that's yellow as well. So that just follows this color scheme over there, just trying to keep things consistent. Next up, as you can see, we do have these arrows, and those arrows stick with it as we're moving around here. So let me go ahead and come back to the base and grab a couple more stuff, and then we can hop back here. So as you can see, as I go up, when I run out of repair bots, that's automatically disabled, and if I come all the way down, it actually takes it completely off the screen as well. We're going to go ahead and take a taser and move it up here, increase the taser. We're out of tasers over here, so it disables. Decrease the taser, and it goes back into the box. So you don't have any empty things in here aside from, again, these are resources specifically for weapons. So since these are resources specifically for weapons, they're allowed to be at 0. And one thing I noticed is sometimes this nans out right here. I actually haven't been able to track down why exactly it does that. I just know it does. And as you can see, I still have my sword, but it's at 4 out of 30 instead of 5 out of 30. So there's evidently something wrong there. I did notice that. It's just, I'm not sure entirely. I didn't look into it, rather is what I should say. I didn't look into what is causing it, because frankly, as you saw on the README, this was a very long process. This is probably the longest I've gone without doing an update for you guys. So I wanted to get this out. That's a very minor problem, that the cargo capacity is not updating correctly. So since that's a very minor thing, I'm going to leave that till next session to fix. That's fine. It's one of those things. We're not officially playable, right? It's not like the game is launched and it's broken or anything like that. So it can be fixed next session, no problem. And one other thing that I should have mentioned is that I left the dev tools up here just so that you can see that everything's above board, that I'm not getting any errors at this point, aside from, again, this not updating properly. And these arrows, technically speaking, sometimes bug out, but again, very minor cosmetic problems, nothing that's actually breaking the game right now. So let's go ahead and switch over to VS Code and actually dig into the code changes. So since earlier on I had mentioned that we made a change to equipment change, I figured we may as well start here. This is a very quick rundown to go over. We made a change to the events on character and added in weapons change, and then the weapons added and removed and the items added and removed. And this just gives us more things to listen to. It makes it more precise, so that's why I did that. And having said that, the next thing to mention is way down here on character. We changed how we are handling the character's inventory. So as you can see, we have this new equipment object right here, which is a modified array. And the reason we're using this equipment for weapons and items is because I wanted to abstract out how exactly we're handling the loadout, because it's one of those things, I'd have a lot of repeating code if I didn't do this, and that repeating code would just get obnoxious, frankly speaking. So in order to abstract that away and make the code a lot more straightforward, we went ahead and just created this new equipment class. So let's hop over to items and go ahead and look at it. So over here in items, the equipment class extends array. And as you can see, when we create this equipment class, it only takes loadout. It does not take items, unlike a normal array. And this loadout determines basically what our starting point is for the array. So we'll take that loadout -1 from it. So let's say this is 5. Character weapons are 5, right? So our loadout is 5. And at the index of loadout -1, which would be 4, that would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 would be 5 items. We go ahead and just set that as undefined to begin with. That way we have 5 slots that are already pre-created. The next thing that you'll notice here is that I disabled splice because I didn't want anybody messing with it. Now, one of these things, I'm the developer, so I'm the only person actually going to be messing with it. Nobody else really will, I mean, unless they, start trying to hack the game while they're playing it. But point being is that I disabled splice and created this private method splice to do the same exact thing. And then when we get down to insert, remove, this is where everything really starts to pay off for having this minor thing. So as you saw from the demo, when we insert things, if it's inside of the loadout, it will shift other things over. So that's the first thing we need to take account for. And the second thing that we need to account for is that any weapon, item, whatever, that is not added to the loadout always goes on the end. So no matter what the index is here, if the item is added after the loadout result, then it is always pushed to the end of the array. So just running through this really quick, as you can see, if the index is greater than this dot length, so this dot length will be at minimum the length of the loadout or possibly longer. So at that point, we're just pushing and returning, and that's it. And as you can see, because this is supposed to emulate this dot push, down here we're also returning this dot length. That's what this dot push normally does. So we're just keeping that straightforward. And then here, as you can see, if this index is undefined, this will only really happen in the loadout section, because otherwise it would be greater than this dot length, because we always make sure that we have no gaps in the indices above loadout. So if it's inside of the loadout and it's undefined, then we don't need to do anything. We can just put it at that item index and then return our length as normal, as mentioned before. And finally, this is where we got to start handling the whole entire shifting. So what we do is we have our shift start, that's the index that we're starting at. We have the shift end. Honestly, it's probably not necessary to do the shift start right here, but I wanted it to be readable. Shift end is going to be, in theory, at most, the next object in our list. So in theory, we will have to move up until that point. And then right here, shift end less than or equal to loadout -1. So if we can't find an empty spot inside of the loadout, that's what we're looking for right here, as you can see. If type of this shift end is undefined, that means that we have a blank spot and we can start shifting to that blank spot. But if we cap out at this dot loadout -1, for example, index 4, if we get to index 4 and we still haven't found an empty slot, we know for a fact that every slot after index 4 is full, because we don't again have any empty spots after loadout. So at that point we can just quit and slide everything. That will just end up sliding everything. So if shift end is less than this loadout, then that means that we need to pull out that empty slot. This means that we found an empty slot inside of the loadout. That's what this means right here. So we will go ahead and delete that empty slot, and that will actually shift all the elements after that slot backwards 1. So let's say that our array looks like this: A, B, none, or not none, null, null, C, D. So that's our loadout right there, and then etc. Okay, and this is everything after the loadout. If we try to insert at 0, then it's going to look, it sees 0 is occupied. Then it starts at shift index +1, or the shift end starts at +1. So it looks at 0 + 1 is 1, sees that is full, is inside this loop at this point, sees it is full, it is not undefined, so therefore it adds +1, and then that would be 1 + 1 is 2, so this is index 2, it sees it's null and it quits. It breaks right here. Shift end is now 2, which is less than 5 - 1, which is 4, which means that it knows at this line, shift end is less than loadout -1, that it can just pull this out And this is what our array looks like at this point. As of this line, that's what this array looks like. And now our new item, which I'm just going to call item Z, which we wanted to put at index 0, can be put at index 0. And as you can see, this is still our loadout right here. We didn't break anything. And we now have Z here, and everything else was shifted by 1 up until the empty spot. So C and D did not move because they did not have to get shifted because we had a null right here. But A is now index 1 and B is index 2. And again, this line right here is what gets us there. And as always, as I mentioned, we returned length as our return value. So then we can go ahead and look at remove. Remove is extremely simple to understand, right? If it's inside the loadout, again, we're allowed to have empty spaces inside the loadout. So we just set that to undefined, return this dot length again. And then if it is not inside our loadout, then we want to make sure we don't have an empty space. So we use splice instead. So we splice the index, remove one element. That's how splice is set up. Index, element to remove, and then in theory, elements to add. But we're not adding anything, we're just removing. So that is very straightforward. Return the new length. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And then what I got here is a very useful convenience feature. And this allows us to find out where items are inside of our array. Now for weapons, this is going to return the first weapon with an ID or a type if those are the things that we're providing. Otherwise, if it is not an item or an ID, or not an item type or ID I should say, then it's going to return the exact match for that item. And I say item generically here, again, it could be weapon or item, but that's how this works. So very straightforward. If it has an ID, then we're going to use that ID instead of the type object to make our code simpler. Otherwise we'd have a third line here. And then if it is an ID, then all we have to do is iterate over our items, all the items in our array, and match that item type ID to this ID that we have here. Again, either the user provided an ID here, or they provided a type which had an ID and we use that ID instead. Otherwise, again, the third one is if it's an instance. If it's an instance, then we just go through all our items and find whether or not, or find one that matches that specific instance. And then finally we offload to this .find index with our finder function, which again will, do whatever is necessary to find the given item. And just to mention, if the item is not in our array, if it's not in our equipment array, then this will return -1 just like normal. This find index is an inherited or prototype method, so it's going to function exactly as normal. We did not overwrite it. A get loadout is very simply just give us everything between 0 and the loadout. Very straightforward. And get additional is the opposite. It's get everything after this dot loadout, or starting with this dot loadout, I should say, because this dot loadout is again 1 based. It starts at 1. So if we have a loadout of 5, that means that indices 0 to 4. So we can start at index 5 right here in the slice, and it will be inclusive 5, as opposed to up here where it's exclusive 5, right? It's inclusive 0 and exclusive 5. Back over here on character, I was looking at these parts right here that I added to update it to work with the equipment object. And I think I actually want to rewrite these guys, so we won't touch on these guys right now. However, further down we have a couple other things. So down here in the combat character class, previously we were copying the whole entire weapons and items. Instead, we're going to just copy the loadouts. That way the combat character only ever has access to what is in the loadout. And down here in randoms, because the loadout can now have gaps in it, I went ahead and added in this filter just to make sure we were not getting any non-weapon weapons. For example, nulls or undefined. In theory, everything should be undefined inside of the loadout, but I figured I'd keep this in just in case this, positive check, make sure it is not falsy, just to be on the safe side. And then down here in update weapons, we updated this to say weapon change instead, because again, I had added that in up here on the character events. And we are disassociating equipment change from weapons, items, and resources, just to keep everything straightforward and understandable. So equipment change is only going to be stuff like transport and your armor, stuff like that, whereas weapons, items, and resources are going to be a separate branch of changes. Obviously, as you can see, I do not have resources added or removed right now. I did not add those because it actually did not come up. I did not run into a situation just yet where I needed to have that updated. We'll see whether or not that changes in the future. I was trying to figure out whether or not to cover add item now or later. Add item and remove item are special functions that had to be written because of how the GUI interacts with everything. The add weapon and remove weapon are very straightforward, generally speaking. So for example, add weapon, we're just going to toss it in there, right? Because this.weapon.insert is going to handle all our problems. And obviously the index, if index is not provided, then we just push it. Very straightforward, it goes on the end. Our weapons equipment object is happy to just push things onto the end because they're not empty spaces. So that's not that big of a deal. And then remove weapon is, again, pretty straightforward. It's just we find the index if we weren't provided the index we're looking for. So for example, if you want to remove by item instance or by the index, you can do either in this case. And then just some checks to make sure we're actually removing a weapon is all this is. Very straightforward. You know, this is not that difficult to understand, right? So I won't bother with that. Otherwise, the weapon is the weapon at the index. We'll remove it and return it. Again, these are the straightforward functions. The add and remove items become a bit more complicated. So I'm going to hop over to the demo really quick, and then we will go ahead and come back to the code after I show you what I'm talking about. So let's say I want to add a repair bot to my inventory, right? So I'm going to take him, drop him up here. He's in my inventory. Well, what happens when I go, you know what? I really wanted repair bots in my loadout. Oh, well, there we go. It took the repair bot out of my inventory and just stacked it up with this one. And this is a functionality that I think is important, just not having multiple. So you cannot, the other thing this does is it prevents you from adding 3 repair bots right across the row, right? So having repair bot, repair bot, repair bot. And the reason why that's important is because these being instances, right, would allow you to just constantly heal, for example, which technically speaking, if we wanted to allow that, we could, but I stated, I believe, I'm 99% sure I stated this in a previous discussion, that I didn't want to. I wanted all your items to be unique. I didn't want you to be able to double up on items. One of those things, it really, what it does is it really just enables more power gaming more than anything else. So that is the reason for that. The other thing to mention is if I hit the up arrow here, obviously we saw this working before, you know, that this comes in here. But the important thing to point out here is that on the back end, what this up arrow and down arrow is actually doing is adding it to the character, and then the character then is going to figure out what slot it needs to put that in. So that's the other thing. So that's the reason why add item, remove item gets a bit complicated, unlike weapons, because weapons are all singletons, they don't have quantities, so we don't have to find out where that item was. Whereas, as you saw, the item was originally up here, but when I try to drop it down here, now it needs to know where that item used to be and move it to, or remove it. You know, it removes it automatically, but it needs to, in the GUI needs to remove where it used to be and put it where it is now. So the GUI needs to know from add item, from the add item function, what exactly is going on and what part of the GUI needs updating in order to keep in sync with what the actual character model is. So that's the logic there, and that's the reason why this is going to be a little bit more complicated. So here in add item, as you might kind of expect, we need to know whether or not we have a previous index and an existing object. So we go ahead and get these, we search for it with get item, because again, if it's going to be put into another index, you know, if the user supplies another index, for example, loadout slot 2, then we're going to have to take that from the previous item and move it. So if it's existing, this previous then becomes the index. Again, this is find equipment index, we went over this. And then we got to handle all that, right? So if it's existing and the type of our index right here, the index passed in, is not undefined, that means that we need to remove it, or we need to move it specifically. So we start by removing it. We remove the existing object, we combine the quantities, and then we can go ahead and set existing to false just because we're done all the prep work here. So we can go into this loop here. So if it's not existing and our index is defined, so in other words, it's not undefined, that means that we can go ahead and put it at that index. And again, this equipment object, this equipment class, will go ahead and handle any shifting that has to happen. And otherwise, if the index is undefined, that's just a push. And then we return the item and any previous index. So the previous index here is maybe null. It may be null if it didn't exist. Otherwise, this is how we got into this loop right here, because we set existing to false. So if it was existing, then we have that previous index it used to be at. Again, we already removed it from that index, so the UI needs to know that it was removed from previous index, which is why we're passing that out. And otherwise, we can just pass it back the item, because the item at this point, again, has all our quantity in it. So it has the updated quantity from the item that we removed, and the quantity that was on the item that was passed in. And finally down here, the way we get here is when we have an existing object, but we have not defined an index to put it at. In that case, if we have not defined an index to put it at, then we're going to just add the item's quantity onto the existing item, and we'll pass back the existing item and the previous index, because the previous index is where all of that now resides. Because again, the user did not provide an index up here. So that's how add item works. Again, that is the rationale behind why we need to do that, because again, the front end needs to know where everything was if it did not previously exist or if it no longer exists. So it needs that feedback. And now on to remove item. Remove item, actually, now that I'm looking at it again, I forgot. The only complicating factor here is just that items have quantity. This actually is pretty straightforward. So again, we try to find it. If we don't find it, then that's a problem. Otherwise, if we do find it and the quantity right here is undefined, then we just remove the item completely, right? We just take the complete item completely out, so that's no big deal. Otherwise, if we do tell it an amount to remove from the item, if we say, okay, remove 3 of the repair bots, for example, then we just got to go ahead and remove only the maximum that we can. So if we only had 2 repair bots, we max out at 2 removed. We have to create a new item, because obviously we're not going to return the item that is still in our inventory. We're going to return an item that has the correct quantity. It has the quantity that we removed from it, because that's what we're expecting. We're expecting to get back an object with the same quantity that we asked for. However, again, if the quantity is different, it's going to be different, which means that we got to use remove quantity instead of the quantity actually passed in. That was probably more verbose than it needed to be, frankly. You probably understood how that worked to begin with. And then if the item no longer has a quantity, if it goes to 0, again, you'll recall when I was hitting the down arrows there, when I hit 0, it took the item off completely. That's what this does here. So very straightforward. And then we return back to the front end, the item and the index that it was removed from, because again, the front end wants to know where this thing was, where this item was that we removed it from, and what the item, however much we removed from it, is. Now, technically speaking, it will not use this information right here, because I think it's safer to just go back to the model and update the index to match the model. But in case we ever need to know, I am still returning the item as well. Again, for right now, the index would have been good enough, because it just needs to know where the item was in order to update the UI, and then it can go ahead and query the character model, or the equipment object, obviously, more specifically, to find out what the current quantity is to update this display. Alright, so I take that back. Actually, I just remembered. The reason we're doing this is because of the reward management system. So remember, we only have just so much luggage space on our spacecraft, and when we're out exploring, we sometimes need to drop this item back off. So this gives us an item to drop back into the treasure pile, so to say, when we need to swap things out in order to take things more important to us. So that is why this is important to return still. Alright, before we go on to the front end stuff, I believe this is the last of the back end stuff. I added to the game object create equipment instance. And the reason why this is useful for us for development is that it allows us to create these object instances without actually having access to items dot, the module itself. So now, because every single part of our code is going to have access to the game object, now we can just call game.create equipment instance in order to create new items, instead of having to go, okay, import items, star as items, and then create new item, etc, 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 etc. So that's the point of this. This is just a factory that gives us a little bit more flexibility in how we're writing our code, so everything does not have to import everything else. and we may make more of these type functions in the future as necessary. Alright, so actually this is kind of borderline depending on how you consider it, front end, back end, because it works with the front end to indicate to the front end to do stuff, but it is also checking the game state, which is technically a back end. So this is the gameplay object, just because I didn't say that at the start. We're in the gameplay sequence object, and this is first transport. So this is the thing that unlocks the docking bay. And I'm 99.9% sure that this is what I added in session 35. I'm pretty sure session 35 was maybe fixing some bugs and then also adding in the transport page, the map page, technically speaking. So I set this as the map unlock just because it gives you access to the map. That's what the docking bay does. But I mean, that may not technically be correct. However, there's no other map unlock that would be applicable, right? Like there's no other unlock for the map other than just getting to the docking bay in order to travel. So frankly, it's one of these things where it's probably accurate. It just maybe could have been. It could have been, I guess I should say, docking bay was our alternative here. But like I said, all this is, it just checks to make sure that we hit what we need in order to get into the docking bay, which I am actually forgetting at the moment. And oh yeah, we get a transport. That's what it is. So our trigger for this is that the player has a transport to travel into space, at which point we unlock the map, provide a message, to the player saying that they have unlocked the docking bay, and remove our listener for this first transport specifically. And then everything else from here is over in colony.gui. So we'll go over that next. So very quickly, straightforward. Here's the map page. Here are some constant strings here. Again, extremely simple to go over. And then down a bit, I guess this is like what, 1/3 of the way down the page here. We have the unlock map, just very straightforward. If we have it unlocked, set up the travel prep page. I go back and forth between calling this, docking bay travel prep page on the screen itself in the English language at any rate. It is labeled as docking bay. Travel prep makes sense to me because you're preparing your mech, you're setting your loadout and your equipment and your cargo space, in preparations for traveling. So that's why I typically go for travel prep. That's the other reason why over in gameplay, you saw I had this labeled as TP. TP stands for travel prep. So as we run down here, it's pretty straightforward. Unlock added is a pretty simple thing to understand. We get some stuff we need in order to display on screen. For example, our transport strings. We get the home page because that's what we need. And then this is the entirety of the page right here. Again, everything else is dynamically filled, but we have fuel and capacity right here. We have the transport name and its flavor up here. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? I don't think I need to go over in depth what exactly all this HTML does. I think it's pretty understandable. These are your cargo space boxes right here. This is the loadout for weapons. This is loadout for items. And then we have a whole bunch of listeners. So right here we have the drag listeners that we need. So this allows us to drag and drop things both into our inventory and out of our inventory. And then we also have these listeners for changing the amount, because again, the front end will ask the back end to, for example, remove one quantity of repair bot or whatever, and therefore we listen to those things in order to update the GUI. So even though the drag callback right here as part of the front end is dragging things in and out of inventory, it does not update the GUI itself until it gets confirmation from the model that weapons have been added, removed, etc, etc, etc. So that is how that works. This is, again, just updates what is necessary. Again, from, for example, the add and remove for the items, that will tell us where exactly those things are being added and removed from. So that all is easy to understand, I think. Just setting listeners at any rate is easy to understand. We have these toggles. So we set actually on the entire page, you'll see this says map page. So we are listening on the entire map page for any clicks. Right here, any clicks. And this will be toggling the quantities on items and resources. So that's how that works. And then right here, the items modified, resources modified. As you can see, it says update toggle arrows. So this would update whether or not the toggle arrows are grayed out or not, whether or not you can actually click them. And now that I've said that, I just wanted to scroll up and show you that we also added those drags to the status panel, because the status panel needs to be available for dragging and dropping as well. Again, dropping onto the status panel actually just puts things back into the colony's inventory. It takes it out of the player's inventory. So it needs the drop over there and the drag over. Drag over, actually I'll cover that when we get over to the actual function itself. We'll talk about why that is up here at that point. And looking at the changelog, 1000 lines later is where we actually get to important stuff. Technically speaking, there are little changes up here. For example, changing this to plus instead of plus maple. So there's little changes like that in between where we just were and at this point. However, they're all extremely minor changes, so I'm not going to bother touching on them. However, here is drag inventory. I will say I had a bit of a trouble setting all this up because in part you can't actually move anything that's not a string in most browsers. Mozilla allows you to move nodes, which is useful, but everything basically has to be a string, which means that I had to go back and forth between what exactly I was storing. And at this point, frankly, I think it could probably be cleaned up a little bit because, again, it was a bit of a mess because things kept on having to be rearranged. But we'll go over it as is, and maybe it gets cleaned up in the future. So first off, targets. So these are things that can be dragged, and we need to actually check that because we set up kind of more than we needed to on the listener. For example, we did the entire status panel, which would not just be the line items in, for example, the weapons box, the items box, and the resources box. That would also be the message box as well. So we need to go through and make sure we're only grabbing things that we actually want. This clear data probably is unnecessary. I'm just doing it to be safe. And also, furthermore, because we set up the drag on the status panel, if we do not actually have anywhere to drag those to, then we actually don't start the drag event. So for example, when you first start the game and get your very first weapon, in theory, the drag listener is on that very first weapon. But if you can't drag it onto your mech, then that doesn't make any sense, right? You don't have anywhere to drag it to. So if we do not have the map, again, the travel prep unlocked, then we're going to just prevent default. We're going to stop you from dragging. So that's pretty easy to understand. Next off, we establish the source. We establish what we're picking up here. And for that, we have this generate element path. So let's go ahead and look at it. So some events actually does give you the entire element tree. I found the entire path to the element you need, but for some reason other ones don't. So since other ones did not, we're just automatically going to generate that ourselves. So that's a very straightforward process of having an element. You know, we have our target element. If it has a parent, then we're going to go ahead and select that parent because we already know what the base element is, right? That's why base element, this Ellie right here, does not go onto the list because it's not necessary. We go ahead and go to the element, get the element's parent, put it on the list, and then check for the next element parent, put it on the list, etc., etc., etc. So again, extremely straightforward function to understand. And that gets us our full path. And then very simply, we need to check whether any of our valid sources, valid targets, I called them earlier, but valid sources in this case, are inside of that list. So very simple, index of, and if it is, we can go ahead and set source and add that source to our event data. Again, I would prefer to be able to add the entire node itself, but we can't, unfortunately. So instead, as you can see, we are just adding the selector. So loadout T-body, loadout weapons is our selector here. Just transport is our selector here. Whatever the selector is what we'll use. And then when we need to find stuff, when we need to actually select that thing again, we'll just use document.query selector to get it back. Next up, as you might expect, if we never found the source, if it's not a valid target, we just return, don't do anything. Next up, this is specifically for resources and items for all intents and purposes. And this just makes sure that we're only going to drag the name itself. Trying to drag the arrows gets a bit wonky, right? So the arrows or the quantities, frankly speaking, basically we would have to instead navigate over to the name, etc., etc., etc. So instead of adding extra code to do that, I just said, all right, make sure to click on the name. If you can't click on the name, then you're not dragging. Not my problem. So that's what that is right there. That just stops you from starting a drag on a quantity or an up or down arrow. And then we need to save some information on what exactly we're dragging, and that's what this whole entire block does. So for example, if we are in the loadout weapons, then we know the type is weapon, and then we can get from the dataset slot what the index is. So the slots, when we set them up there in the HTML above, each of those had data slot equals 0, 1, 2, 3, etc, etc, etc. That would be the index. I did not start those at slot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, because the player actually never sees that information. That's entirely backend information. So even though I might refer to the very first slot as slot 1 of your weapons loadout, everything else understands that as slot 0, as index 0. So one of those things just to keep in mind is that what we think of as the first slot is always 0 indexed. And then the ID is just taken from the player object itself, just to keep things simple. Since we know the index, rather than trusting the GUI to be up to date, we want to trust the player model instead. So we just hop onto the player model, get the index, type ID, etc, etc, etc. Easy peasy. And the rest of this should be fairly straightforward. Again, does the same exact thing in loadout items as before, and again, for both ID and quantity, refers to the model itself to make sure it is synced with the model. For status weapons, so this is the stuff that is on the colony. The colony does not save objects. It only saves quantities and IDs. That's how we have it set up. So for that reason, for status weapons, the line item on the status weapons box will have its ID there. It won't have a slot because it doesn't keep track of slots. It only keeps track, as I said, of IDs. And then the quantity is always 1 for weapons, but if we come down here to status items, as you can see, status items and status resources, I should say, as you can see, we'll try to get 1, but the colony get item, if it is less than 1, we will take that minimum, which in theory should only ever be 0. We should never have negative quantities, but we don't want to accidentally grab a quantity of 1, unlike weapon here, unless we have it. And with that being said, it just occurred to me that actually we're going to need to do the same thing here. So originally I was thinking that I was going to remove the weapon completely from the UI, but I just realized it does not actually do that. It does leave it at quantity 0 on the UI. So my original intention of removing the weapons from the UI does not actually work. So this really should be this.colony.getWeapon minimum 1. So I'm going to go ahead and change that really quick right here. Now, this never broke on me. This actually never broke on me in practice, because when we get down to the drop event, you'll see that the drop event actually takes into account whether or not the player still has a quantity left. So for that reason, technically speaking, all of these are unnecessary, but, you know, better safe than sorry. So technically speaking, even if I change this to 1 right here for status items and status resources, it still wouldn't necessarily be a problem, because the column, when we go to drop it, nothing would happen. What this does change is, I'll skip over transport really quick, but what this does change is down here in this not quantity. So by doing this, we actually stop the drag event from doing anything at all to begin with, and it flashes the text red to show that you don't have a quantity. So that is why this is useful, honestly. But beyond that, again, technically speaking, we could get away with, you know, just dragging and then trying to drop, and the drop event would stop us from doing that. Technically speaking, it wouldn't break, but it is better to have this right here in order to make sure that quantity ends up as 0 anyway. And then we'll backtrack to transport really quick. Transport, this is why up here we made sure we were actually on the object itself, the top level element itself for each of the transport items, each of the cargo items. And that's because we can take the information directly from the data set, right? Otherwise, before we did any of this, we'd have to recurse up, you know, and just pseudocode right there, but recurse up to that top level element in order to get this information. We could do that, but it's easier just to avoid that situation altogether. The benefits are really not substantial to bother adding that extra code in. Down here on quantity though, for weapons, this actually is the entire quantity that is in the cargo for the player. And that's why this will stay as 1 right here, because the weapons on the player are only ever quantity 1. Unlike up here where the colony has multiple copies of each weapon, because again it only stores ID and quantity. On the player stores instances. So it stores an instance of the weapon, it stores an instance of the item. So it needs, the actual full quantity that it's dragging, which again for weapons will only ever be 1. So we can skip this right here, quantity, because we already talked about that. And finally, we store this as this really obtuse string. I mean, I don't like this. This is annoying. But because of the way data transfer works on the drag data transfer object, this is what we got to do, unfortunately. So we'll store the type as text type and then ID index quantity. And that's how we're doing it. I prefer not to. I prefer to drag an object, but that just plain does not work, evidently. So, drag over. So, for the time being, we are allowing you to drag over and drop into everything. The drag over event for drag and drop HTML5 determines whether or not you can drop the object. That actually is what the drag over event does. It will change, it will toggle between do not drop this here. We will not trigger a drop event if you drop this here. And it toggles that over to you can drop this here. We're going to change the icon on the screen and we will trigger a drop event when you let go of the mouse button. That's what the drag over event is for in, again, HTML5 drag and drop. And the way you allow it is by preventing default. So the drag and drop API for HTML5 defaults to no, you cannot drop this. So if you only set up a drag and a drop event in HTML5 and did not include this drag over event in order to prevent default, then you'd never actually be able to drop the object. When you let go of the mouse, it just simply goes away. The drag event ends, the drag data disappears as far as I'm aware, and you never get the drop event. So that is why this is necessary. And again, for the time being, because our default stance is if you drop it somewhere you're not supposed to, it just takes it out of your inventory and puts it back into the colony. Since that's the functionality we have, we're just going to allow the player to drop anything anywhere, because we know exactly where that item is going and where it came from. And finally, onto the drop inventory, the drop event. So we have the same 6 areas where you can drag and drop it from, right, listed here, but we have these split up a little bit. So these are valid areas where you can drop them. So if you drop in these 3 areas, then it will go into these 3 areas. If you drop into one of these 3 areas, so for example, if you drop an item into the resource area, let's say, it doesn't matter whether it's into the resource area, the items area, or the weapons area, any of those situations, it will take it out of the player's inventory or just kind of out of the floating state that it's in. Technically speaking, that's not how that works, but gloss over that for the moment being. It will take it and put it directly into the colony. And then we go ahead and get the source. Again, the source is a query, so we're going to have to go ahead and run that through document.query selector. And then we got to figure out where the heck we stored that at. The type, actually, let me scroll back a little bit. This type used to actually be the first element in here. And then I was trying to determine, trying to only let the player drop it in specific areas and instead of just letting them drop wherever. And that's why the type got moved up here. Again, I started this whole entire conversation with, and by this whole entire conversation, I mean since we got over here, I said, you know what, I'm pretty sure the drag and drop code, because I went through so many iterations, is going to need to be cleaned up. You'll recall that, right? This is one of those areas. This type can be moved back at this point now because we're no longer using this to indicate what we're dragging. So this bit of code right here is probably going to disappear in the future, and we'll just parse out, change it back to parsing this out like this. So instead of this being text type, generically type whatever this is, it will probably go back to being, I don't know, text anything really. It could be text object, whatever. It doesn't necessarily matter. And then we'll just go in here, get that out of the data transfer, and then split it on the slash lines again. And then we'll have, instead of ID, we'll have type, and it will look like this. So that is going to change in the future. Again, this session was so long that I didn't bother coming back through the code and trying to clean it up. I just wanted to get this launched. So that will change. Again, all this results in is just deleting this. Like I can literally make the change right now. It's 5 seconds. So change that to object, and then we'll change this to object. Toss that in there, and we're done. So the code is officially updated, right? Oh, I'm sorry. Type. There we go. Type boo. So that's, current code. That will be what it is. So. First thing we need to do is we need to figure out where the heck we were dragging from, because where we were dragging from, we need to actually pull the item out of. If we're dropping in the transport and we're dragging from the loadout, then we need to remove the item from the loadout and drop it into the transport. If we're dragging from the status box, we need to remove it from the status box and put it into the transport. So very straightforward, easy process. Again, this is another area where I think I could probably make some optimizations. For example, might be able to combine these 3 if statements and make it a little bit more streamlined, but for the time being, it's one of those things. They all work exactly the same, and they're just, if the colony does not have a quantity, because while you were dragging it, for example, the meeples ate the weapon, let's say. I don't know if that will ever actually happen, but they certainly eat food. So if you were dragging food and the meeples ate the food you were trying to drag and you now have 0 food, it will just stop us from dropping and return. And then we subtract it from the colony, trigger an event letting the UI know that we dropped it from the colony, the UI and anybody else who cares, right? That we subtracted it from the colony. And then we use that create equipment instance that we set up before in order to create a new instance to match that. Because again, if we're taking it from the colony, then the colony does not have the instance itself. We need to create the instance. Colony only has ID and quantity. Again, that's a copy paste down to these 3, which is why I'm pretty sure that I can combine these 3 into just one block and then just modify a couple little things to keep the code a little bit cleaner, a little bit more straightforward, a little more streamlined. Technically speaking, this is more readable if you don't know what you're looking at, but so if it is not in any of the status boxes, now we're talking about player inventory. So these 3 sections all handle coming from the player inventory. So the player will remove a weapon by index because we have the index. That's one of the things we parsed out right here, right? And when it removes the weapon, it returns the weapon. So now we have the item itself. We have the instance itself instead of having to call this.game.create equipment instance. We have that actual instance out of the player's inventory. And again, trigger to let everybody know, let the UI update, etc., etc. The items. So if we're removing it from the items, then we need to update with the previous index to let the UI know where the previous index was. Pretty easy. And then with resources, actually, because the player handles resources in the same exact way the colony does, because the resources are just kind of numbers, right? They're just little toggles. So they don't actually do anything, and therefore they don't have an instance, naturally speaking. There's no need to keep an instance of them around. So for that reason, we go ahead and create an instance ourselves, and that will be easy enough. Now, at this point, we are on to dropping. So once again, we need to establish our path in order to figure out where exactly we're dropping into. So if we are dropping into the loadout weapons and our type is weapon, so this is a valid drop location because they match, right? Loadout weapons matches weapon. Then we need to actually figure out what slot we're dropping into. And this comes up because our event.target right here may not actually be the slot itself, especially if it's occupied. If it's occupied, then it's more likely to be whatever was in there before. So for example, if I have battle axe in the first one, I try to drop the kinetic rifle into the first one, then that TD, that table data element, is what is going to be element target. So we actually need to go up and find our top level one and parse out the data slot. And by top level one, I actually do not mean this top level table. We have this catch here just in case things go off the rail and is super random. Actually, I should say we have this here more specifically in case we drop into the area between the slots. So especially on weapons table, it's in a X shape, right? So if we select any of those table datas in between, then this will not trigger because those do not have a slot on them, and therefore we'll know we need a way basically to stop us from just recursing ad infinitum. So the way we do that is we stop as soon as we hit the table itself, as soon as we recurse all the way out. But if we do find a slot, then we set the index, and down here, as you can see, if we never find the index, then we're just going to set it as the first one. If you read this note right here, this means that, remember those empty slots in the X-shaped pattern that I was talking about? If you drop into one of those, then it automatically goes into index 0. So instead of dropping into one of those and removing it and putting it back into the colony, it still, the assumption is that you just missed, right? So if you just missed, then you want in the loadout, so we're going to put in the loadout for you. We could attempt to determine what the closest loadout slot is. That would be more precise, but I don't feel it's necessary at this point. Get good, scrub. Stop dropping into empty spaces. Now, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. We need to check when we drop this thing whether or not the loadout shifted. If the loadout did shift, then we need to go ahead and trigger an event saying that the loadout shifted. So what we do is we capture a glimpse of what the weapons used to be. And then until we get out of the loadout, and one past the loadout more specifically, because we want to see whether or not all the items after loadout also moved. But if all the items after loadout also moved, then we know for a fact that we can just update the one transport thing. We'll get to that in a minute because that function, is more specifically, I should say more generally, actually, is the more correct term to use there. That object is a lot more general than the slot updates. So we go through, we check, and if the new index does not match the old index, that means that it moved, right? So we trigger that event on that index. So if we had 3 weapons slide down the loadout list, then we'll trigger an individual event for each of those items that got shifted down. We scroll down here to loadout items. It works exactly the same exact way, so no big deal there. Literally word for word. And again, this is another area where we could probably combine these two because they're the same thing. I just wanted to keep it straightforward for the time being. Again, this is more readable if you don't know what's going on than setting this up and smushing these two together. And then we got the transport. So transport, if it's a weapon, we put it in the weapon. So this actually doesn't care whether or not you drop a weapon into the weapon slot. You could drop a weapon into the items box instead, and it will just still put it into the weapons box. So this is a bit more forgiving. The items, as you might suspect, have a little bit more going on. Again, we talked about how add item included item and previous index, and that is in case, again, it was, for example, in your loadout and then you place it into the storage. So that's the purpose of this one. And I should say you take, for example, a status in element from the status box and put it into storage when you had it in the loadout. That's the more precise example of when this happens. And again, all that is we just need to know if there's a previous index. If it is, remove it, and otherwise add it. And resources. Resources are only ever in one place, so this is actually extremely simple. We just trigger a resource change. We don't have to worry about checking if it was in a previous space or, whether or not the weapons list changed or anything like that. With resources, it's only ever in one place, so we only ever have to just notify people that we added a resource. So that was very simple. Now, in case you did not notice, at the bottom of each of these was a dropped equals true. Okay, So if we did not drop it correctly, if we dropped it in somewhere it was not supposed to go, that's this block here. And this is all just add it back into the colony. Very straightforward. I mean, there's no explaining there. You can see what happens. And finally, we update the map weight. And again, for whatever reason, this is a little bit bugged right now. That will get fixed in the future, but one of those things. Simple, straightforward function, which should, in theory, just add all the weights together and update the page. That's right here, yes. So the game.player.weight should have all the weights that the player and the transport are carrying. And then we just update the span right here. Easy peasy. This update map transport is just for whenever the player buys a new transport, it just updates the information on the screen. You know, you can see fuel, capacity, etc. The strings, the transport strings right here. So that's an easy, straightforward function. And then this is the callback that gets called for add and remove items and weapons. So in here, as you can see, add remove weapons. First, it checks whether or not the index, the event.index, is in the loadout. If it does, it updates the specific loadout for that index. So if you're removed from index 0, it only updates index 0, or it only updates slot 0 rather. And if you add to slot 1, it only updates slot 1 on the GUI. So that is how that works. And otherwise, it calls this .reload transport type. And this is the more generalized one, right? So we'll go ahead and hop down here to look at that really quick before we cover the rest of this. So for reload transport type, we figure out what the type is and get the correct transport thing. So for example, that box that said weapons and it had a list of all your weapons in the transport, that's the thing we get. We clear that out and then we start adding them back in. And the reason we're doing this is because it's a lot easier than trying to find exactly what index got shifted and then trying to shift everything else in and etc, etc. So instead we're going to just keep it simple. We're going to clear everything out and then add everything back in. So this is just us getting the additionals, so everything not in the loadout, and getting the index where that starts. Or otherwise, if this is resources, then index starts at 0 because again, resources are resources. So for each of those things in items, we go ahead and get the item. If the item is not there, then we'll skip it. It really, as this note says, should only happen for resources because resources are stored by ID in a mapping object, a hash map. I mean, it's not actually a hash map, but it's an object, So that's the only time that should really happen. So then we go ahead and populate the cargo line. That's easy enough. Just insert it into the bucket, and if it's an item, then we add quantity. Now, looking back through this, I actually realized first off that this is wrong. So this is technically wrong. The next thing that I noticed is that I wonder whether or not this is actually called by resources, because resources have their own function right here. So again, this being something that went over, this is, well, all right, it's been 2 months technically since I started this, session 35 to session 36 combined, right? It's been over 2 months. So I think I just lost track and left this in here after I added update mech resources to handle resources separately. So chances are if I went searching, I'd find out that reload transport type never gets called for resources, in which case this right here is unnecessary, and as is this line right here, because again, the equipment types, which again were added much later than this function existing, make sure that the item never actually is empty. The slot is never empty after the loadout, which is what we're filling in right here. So coming back up here to update player inventory, that's what we just looked at right here. And then if the weapon has ammunition, we need to update the mech resources for that ammunition type. We are defaulting to 1 here because we need to have a quantity there, a positive quantity there for this callback, because this callback handles all resource changes and it skips any resource change that is 0. So we need a resource change in here, and it's going to ignore our resource change anyway because it only keeps track of exactly the quantity that is on the player. And this is obviously the code that allows us to auto-populate the transport with the ammunition for the weapon, in case that was not clear. So this is the magic that makes that happen. And then for items, it's the same exact thing. We just include item instead of weapon. I just copied it down here. Again, technically speaking, I could rearrange this so that we set type, you know, for example, do something like this. Type equals weapon. And then item added. Item removed. Item. And then we can back this stuff all off. And delete this stuff. And change this to type right here. Type. And if type equals weapon, and there we go. So that's how we could rearrange this stuff. And one of those things, more straightforward this way. Honestly, I think I will keep it this way. Again, I wasn't too concerned about having my code organized. I was more concerned about getting this the heck done. So some live updating right here. Should still work. Nothing should have broken. And actually this, again, I'd have to check whether or not this is actually in here. So let's check really quick. Okay, so we are actually going there for resources changed. The funny thing is that I don't know. Okay, so what we can do then in that case is we can change this to resources modify or update mech resources. And because I don't think it's really necessary to do this for update mech resources. Let's see, that's where we're at. Yeah, that's the only place that update mech resources was called from to begin with. So I think that's probably a bit simpler. Again, keeping these a bit more separated works out just fine. So a little bit of live coding right here. Never hurt anybody. So I'm pretty sure we skipped over this, but update loadout just finds the correct slot, clears out the correct slot, gets the correct equipment from the player, not from the event, you know, and then updates it to have the correct display thing. And again, if it's an item as before, then we add the quantity back in. So that's everything. So since add quantity is literally between these two functions, and this is the second time I've mentioned add quantity just adds on to the element before end, as you can see. So inside of the brackets, it adds a span with quantity on it, data quantity as a tag, and then adds this little table here with the plus and minuses. Again, this is to reuse our formatting for the meeples. That's why this is a table right here. So we're just reusing what we already have built. And if we do not have a quantity, then it sets -2 disabled. Pretty easy. All right, and now on to update mech resources, which we had alluded to previously. So for each resource in the resource change, we check if there was actually a change. If there was not, we don't do anything. So that's no big deal. Otherwise, we get the quantity. Now, if we do not have a quantity, then like with items, as I showed you before, we're going to want to remove that item. However, if it's ammunition, we need to not remove it because that is there specifically because the player has a weapon in his inventory. So we go ahead and come through, we check if it's ammo, run through all the weapons, see if it has a valid ammo. If it's not ammo, then we can remove it and we're done. We can just, you know, go to the next resource. Otherwise, at this point, if we do not have a quantity, and this is again basically only if it's weapon ammunition, we can set that quantity to 0. Now, the easiest thing is if this resource already exists on our list, because at that point we can see up all the way down here and just add in the quantity. You know, that is the easiest thing in the world. And honestly, I probably should swap these around to do that. But again, we're not going to worry about that. I was more concerned about getting this part because this is the more complicated part. Basically, I think it makes sense for resources to always be in ID order. Because again, resources are stored in ID order, so they probably should be displayed in ID order. It keeps things simple and uniform. For that reason, we need to actually find out where to put this. So in order to do that, we need to hop through all the other things in the resource element, in the resource box, I should say, the cargo box. and find out what element to put it in front of. If we did not find an element to put it in front of, then we're going to do it before end of the cargo box. So we'll stick it in at the end if there's no other elements that come after it. Otherwise, if there is an element that comes after it before begin, we'll put it there. And this is just the string we're putting in here. Easy peasy. Then because we technically don't know where that element's at between these two, we go ahead and find it really quick by searching for its ID, and we add quantity to it. Again, this add quantity function is useful because it's a uniform way of adding quantity to everything, so everything is stylized the same exact way, and we know exactly if we're trying to maneuver our way through a specific object, we know exactly where to find what we're looking for. So that's why this .add quantity is a useful function to have. And then the last thing we do is we just set the arrows. So we check whether or not the colony has anything that we can add to this object, to this resource. So if the colony quantity is 0 or undefined, if we've never found this quantity, for example, if this is a weapon that we have never found the resource to power the weapon with, or if we simply have no more quantity in the colony, then we can go ahead and disable the plus button. And then finally, we update the map weight because we just added resources. So that makes sense. And that brings us to our last two functions. So this one is update mech availability. And this one, as you can see, just toggles the arrows that switches in between disabled and enabled down here. And it functions for both resources modified and items modified on the colony. So we got to figure out which one of those two it is, which is this block of code right here. Just, set up type as a resource and then the correct callback to get how many we have. And then obviously down here, just a catch here, get the map page because we'll be query selecting. If quantity is less than or equal to 0, that means that we cannot increase the item or resource quantity on our mech. So therefore we add the disabled tag to all these, or class more precisely. And otherwise, if we do have a quantity, that means that we can remove the disabled class from all of these plus elements right here. So pretty simple, straightforward, easy to understand. And finally, this is the code that actually adds and decreases the quantities of items and resources on the mech. So as you can see, this is on click event and this is on the entire map page. So first thing we got to do is figure out whether or not it's a plus or a minus arrow because we don't have distinct callbacks for either of those. And then if it's neither plus nor minus, then obviously it's not the correct thing. So we go back. And otherwise, if it's disabled, we also go back because if it's disabled, we weren't supposed to click on it in the first place. And based on whether or not it was a plus or a minus, it determines what the quantity change is. So this mod right here is the quantity change. And then we got to go up to the top level element. So back to this is the arrow, this is a sub element. And we got to find the actual top level element, which will tell us what the ID is in order to actually change the quantity. So once we have the top level element, again, this is just recursive finding. Then we have the ID off of the data set. We can grab the player and based on whether or not it is a plus or a minus, again, mod greater than 0 or less than 0. Well, less than or equal to technically speaking, but it's only going to be one of these two. Based on that, if type, and type I kind of glossed over here, but we also set that up here in line with ID. So if the type is a resource, we get resource from the colony. If the type is an item, we get item from the colony, easy enough. And we got to make sure that it is available, which means that it is greater than 0 in both of those cases. Otherwise, this is a minus, we're taking it from the player. So we got to decide whether or not the player actually has a resource. And I'm just using Boolean here, easy enough. So if it's a positive number, it will be true. If it's 0, it will be false. And if we do not have the quantity available, not available, then we can just return because we can't move any items. And the final block is pretty straightforward, right? For resources, we have mod greater than 0. And again, that means that we are taking it from the colony and giving it to the player. As mentioned in other parts of the code, we got to create the resource instance right here in order to pass it to the player because the player only accepts resource instances. But on the other end, if we are taking it from the player, again, player technically treats those as just ID and value pairs, which means that we can just take it out of its ID slot on the player and give it to the colony, which treats it in the same exact way, so same exact code. And then finally, we just gotta trigger some events to let people know that things changed. So the GUI will update, for example, the status panel to let us know that what the new quantity is on the colony, and the player's cargo hold to tell us what the new resource is in the cargo hold. Over on item, we get the previous index as previously noted. That is because we don't know where in the player's mech this is. It could be in the cargo hold, it could be in the loadout. So if it's greater than 0, that means that's coming from the colony. Again, create that item instance to pass it to the player add item. And as before, we got to do the previous index. I've explained this a couple times now, so I'm not going to go into much detail there. Easy enough. And then taking it from the player. As you can see here, as the note says, we are looking for the actual instance because get item relies on the instance. And since the instance should only be in one place on the player, that's what we need. So we can go ahead and remove that one value from the player. It's absolute value because it's supposed to be a positive going into remove item, not a negative. So that gets passed off to the player. It tells us what the previous index is so that we can pass that off to the event down here. And we give it to the colony. Again, colony, items, resources, and weapons are all ID value pairs, ID quantity key value pairs. So we can just plug that in, no problem. And at the very bottom here, we have items modified for the colony because that works the same way whether you're here or here, as opposed to down here on the trigger event. As you can see, this is items added and this is items removed. So those are two different events for the player, but it's the same event for the colony. And that is everything. And looking at the changes, that is basically everything as far as I can tell. There might be some little things that I only briefly touched on, but won't bother going over. And obviously the data manager, that is a separate video in and of itself, so I won't bother going over that. So it looks to me like we are more or less done here. So thank you guys for watching. For those of you that were excited for more LiteLike updates, sorry it took so long. It should hopefully be going a lot more quicker now that I'm back in the swing of things. So look forward to future updates coming more quickly. And next up on the docket would be actually doing the map travel itself. We have the map travel demo already up, so it's probably going to be not much more than copying over a lot of that code and then making sure that things are plugged in correctly, for example, event callbacks, etc. And from there, we're pretty darn close to being done the game. I know I've said that a number of times before, and then we had this massive, 50,000 hour update here. So I know I keep on saying that we're close, honest, we're close. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely closer than we were last time I said that, right? So at the very least, we're closer to being towards the end. So all of that having been said, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a great and wonderful day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at in the world. And I will catch you next time.